Hi, welcome to our new community group discussion series, 10 Times Better. The world around us is changing every day. Just turn on the news or scroll through your social media. Culture is completely different than it was even 5 years ago. Selfishness, violence, division, a blatant rejection of Christianity. These seem to be the norm for a society that is loudly broadcasting its views all around us. And it's no secret that the state of our world has left many discouraged, confused, and fearful. Can we maintain faith in a world that seems to have lost hope? Where is God in all of this? Over the next 6 weeks, our online pastor, Rocky Hernandez, will be hosting a discussion with two of our pastors each week as they explore the life of Daniel, looking closely at his journey living in Babylon, a wicked, dark, godless place where Daniel not only survived, but thrived, thanks to his faith in the power of God. After each discussion, we will hear a personal story from someone who's working through these very issues. In this session, we'll hear from Ashley, who faced the battles of a lifetime. Uncertainty and darkness were closing in on her, and yet she found a light in the darkness. But first, let's join Rocky and pastors Paul McDill and Randy Wade as they lay out the groundwork for our new series, 10 Times Better.
Welcome to 10 Times Better, our community group series. We're so glad that you have made the commitment to join and to be part of a group. I am here today with pastors Paul McDill and Randy Wade. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. We have
It's good to be here.
Yeah, we have a lot of great things to look forward to throughout this series. But Paul, you're here to kind of just set the stage for us. So why don't you go ahead and tell us what we can expect over the next few weeks?
Man, I am so excited about this series. You know, we're calling it 10 Times Better, and I'll get to why we named it that in just a minute. But really, we're looking at the story of Daniel.
Yeah.
And the book of Daniel is an interesting book. I think a lot of times we think about it as great children's stories.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you want to have some great children's stories from the Bible, the book of Daniel has some of the best ones. And there's adventure. There's fiery furnaces, there's lions' dens, there's a lot of stuff going on. There's miracles, there's prophecies, but really it's more than that. It's a book that tells us how to live in a world that feels like we don't belong in.
Yeah.
And, you know, we're living in a world that oftentimes feels like this is not where we belong. In fact, in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11, it calls us strangers and aliens in this land. That as believers, this is not our home. This is not normal for us. And so the book of Daniel really helps us to see how to live in a place that's not normal for us. And it does that because the context for this story is in about 600 BC, the Babylonians came in and they captured Jerusalem. And when they captured it, they took out some of the best and the brightest. And so Daniel and some of his friends were exported out of Jerusalem into Babylon. And Babylon was an interesting place because Babylon was an evil place.
Right.
There was a lot of bad stuff going on in Babylon. And Daniel and his friends had to figure out how to live in that setting. They were used to being in Jerusalem, and now they were brought into a place that was not their home, was not where they belonged. Their religion wasn't upheld. They were having to live by different standards, under different leadership, under different authority. And so, you know, when their whole world was turned upside down, how did they do it? And so really this book and this series is a guide for us, not for kids. It's not a story about lions' dens and fiery furnaces. It's a guide for how adults are to live in a world that they don't belong in. The name comes from at the end of the first chapter, I think it's verse 20 of chapter 1, it says that Daniel and his friends did 10 times better than all the rest.
Yeah.
Because they were doing it God's way, they were able to do 10 times better than the rest.
Yeah. I think that's what has me most excited just about this series, because, you know, it was by God's sovereign hand that Daniel and some of these other people were moved into this evil place.
Right.
You don't get the sense that they were just trying to survive, but they modeled how to, under the authority of God's sovereignty,
Right.
thrive. in a very evil place. And so I'm excited about that because I think that as believers, we live in a culture where we need to hear that we are not in survival mode. We're thriving, and we're thriving under the authority of God's sovereignty. And we're not here at this moment in this period of time in history by accident. We have been divinely placed by God to thrive in a way that would point people to the hope that we have.
Yeah, that's good. In fact, the first 3 verses really give us the key to this whole book of the Bible, to this whole series. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. And, Daniel's writing these words, not at the time that it happened. He's writing these looking back. And those little 3 words are really key to understanding this whole series and this whole book of the Bible. And it's when Daniel writes that the Lord gave Jerusalem into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was an evil king, but from Daniel's perspective, looking back, he could see that, hey, God was in control of who was in control.
Wow. That's incredibly timely because I think that every year that goes by, we feel more and more like strangers. And especially as believers, we feel more and more that our belief system can feel as though it's in opposition to what so many people are talking about, whether it's online or in person, and even in the church. And we're struggling with all these things. And how to, you're saying that we can actually thrive in that environment, and that's incredible.
Yeah, not only thrive, we should feel like outsiders.
Wow.
Because this world's not our home. As Christians, that's why it's so important, and for Daniel as a follower of God, this is why it's so important to say, I'm not going to necessarily thrash against everything in the world, but to step back and go, okay, I'm going to live out my faith to the best of my ability, trusting that God's going to leverage all of this nonsense, all of this craziness, all of this brokenness in a way that ultimately will bring people to him.
Yeah, this whole thing blows me away because our tendency when bad things happen or when we feel isolated from the world, and I see this on social media and I get asked this question a lot, especially when we're thinking about the changing of the world, is there's a fear response. But what you guys are saying as our pastors is actually God is using this, like one, it's on purpose, it feels like by design. And when this is happening, when we find ourselves being separated from the world, that's a good thing because God is leveraging it. And to what end, though?
Rocky, let me, even just to expand on that just a little bit, that I think is super interesting in this. It's not just that God is using some other people.
Right.
God is using evil people. In fact, in Revelation chapter 18, the Bible tells us that in the end, the angels are going to be celebrating by proclaiming, fallen, fallen is Babylon. Wow. Fallen, fallen, not fallen, fallen is Nazi Germany, not fallen, fallen is Iraq. They're celebrating the fall of the Babylonian culture.
Wow. That when we see that happening in the world, not to politicize it, but like we see what, depending on what side it is, it's always a wicked leader, isn't it? Right. For sure, it's always a wicked leader. And wherever you fall on that spectrum, your tendency is to want to freak out. And we have seen in the past few years, just the volatility that is caused by that. Even within the church, people not wanting to do things because one political leader says this or one political leader says that. And you don't really know where you stand in all of that as a believer. And you just kind of feel like just pulled in and if you let it creates fear, and that fear leads to anger. And that anger kind of leads to this crisis of faith and understanding.
Every 4 years, it happens in a major way that you see people hand-wringing and saying, and I understand why it happens because politicians want us to think that everything is super urgent, and we start talking about how this is the most important election of our lifetime, and I'm not downgrading that, and I have some pretty strong political opinions,
Right.
as y'all both know.
Oh, we both know. Yes.
as you know, I've got some pretty strong political opinions, but I also have a really strong opinion that at the end of the day, God is not surprised by what happens
Right.
politically, and at the end of the day, God is in control of who's in control. And when we as believers start saying, oh, well, I mean, man, this is the end. I always come back to, man, we are really short-sighted historically when
Right.
we do that. We really have eliminated our rearview mirror.
For sure.
Because looking back on it, we've had some times that you go, man, how did we make it through that?
Yeah.
And the way we made it through that was God was in control of who was in control.
Right.
And what if it is the end? I mean, that should not, as believers, that should not be something that we fear.
Yeah.
So even if the worst person ever is about to be elected and everything is going to, we learned in Genesis, it's all broken.
Yeah.
All of it is broken.
Yeah.
And it's going to stay broken until we get to the end. And so at some point, yeah, it is going to be the end, and Christians should not lose their minds about that part of it.
So let's say that I'm able to build up enough faith to say, okay, I trust that God is leveraging this, because that was, one of the big points here.
Yeah, sure.
God is using this, but God is using it to do what?
Well, one of the things that God was using this whole situation for, first of all, God's always using whatever's happening to bring his glory.
Right.
That's God's chief aim in this world, is to bring his glory. And so God's jealous for that, the Bible tells us,
Right.
that he's going to accomplish his name being lifted up and glorified. So God's always doing that. But he also, not only does he bring his glory, but he does what's best for his people.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's a little painful. And so, the context of this story is that God was bringing judgment on the Israelites. And in Jeremiah, I think it's Jeremiah chapter 21, it's talking about that God's gonna, hey, listen, y'all are about to go through some stuff. That's
Right.
what God's saying. Y'all are about to go through some stuff, and it's because of your wickedness. It's because you've turned away from God. And that was the way the Israelites, that's the story of the Old Testament, is they would come in and God would do something great and they'd go, yay, God, yay, God. And then when they had gotten really comfortable with what God had done, they would start worshiping other idols. And,
Oh, yeah.
And God would have to bring a judgment because he was always trying to draw them back to himself. And so the context here is that God was using the Babylonians, the wicked, evil people, to judge his people and to say, listen, I love y'all too much to let you keep wandering off after other gods.
Wow.
I love you too much for that. So
Yeah.
I've got to discipline you, and the scripture's clear on this, that God disciplines those he loves,
For
much
sure.
like we do as parents. Any good parent knows if I don't discipline my child when they're young, then we're in for a long, tough road. And
Yeah.
so the discipline that you do as a parent is not because I like punishing my kids. It's because I love my kid too much to let them wander off
Right.
and not pull them back.
So if we are trusting God in this situation, in difficult circumstances, we recognize, one, that God is using the situation, and even though it is a difficult situation, he's going to bring glory to himself, and he's going to bring more godliness out of his people. Have you guys ever experienced that sort of discipline in your life?
Yeah, I've certainly felt disciplined by God several times in my life, but one of the most recent, and I think it works well in the context of our conversation, I like politics. I used to love politics. I kind of like it now. It's changed for me because I realized about a year ago that I was way more interested in who voted for my guy than who knew my God. And whenever I felt that conviction, I realized, you were watching way more news and reading way more articles about political things. And I don't want to say that those things don't matter, because I do think that they matter. It's part of the world we live in. I think Christians need to be engaged and involved. But I
No,
realized
this was kind of a bummer to me because I used to call Randy and say,
Yeah.
"Hey, did you see what so and so said?" And we've had this political talk.
And now I'm like,
then
yeah,
I'm
I
like,
haven't
Randy
really-
would be like, "I don't know, I haven't
seen it.
Oh,
And
come on, Randy.
yeah, and I've actually gotten flack from lots of friends. They're like,
Oh,
"What? Do you,
yeah.
That's just a cop out." No, I'm trying to guard my heart because in my flesh, I let that become the main thing, and I realized I was fighting battles that weren't mine to fight. That my calling was just different than that.
That's good.
And so that's some people's calling. It's not my calling. And where it became really clear to me was as a pastor, and I do believe I'm called by God to be a pastor. And there are people on different sides of the political aisle that my calling trumps my political viewpoints because I've been called to pastor people that I may disagree with politically. I can't let that get in the way of it. And so this story of Daniel really resonates deeply with me because the way I was disciplined by God was, okay, now you're in this culture, and I started buying into the culture, the rhetoric of the culture, that these are the main things, these are the most important things, these are the priorities. And God comes in and says, no, this world's not your home. These things are all temporary. You are hyper-focused on things that are all going to go away. Different people are going to be elected next November, and then in a couple of more years, and then in a couple more years, and a couple more. This is ever-changing, and your allegiance just needs to be something different. Again, that was the discipline for me.
That's good.
It doesn't necessarily mean it's the discipline for everybody else, but it was for me. And the story of Daniel, to me, is just, it's very comforting because it edifies in my spirit that it's okay to live in a culture where everything feels like it's becoming more and more contrary to what I believe, and that I can still thrive in that culture because of who I am.
Yeah, that's good.
Man, those are two hugely powerful lessons. And I know that we're going to get a lot more of that in this series. Break it down for me, one sentence. Ultimately, what is the takeaway from this series? 10 times better.
God, one sentence. Let me give you a couple of sentences. Okay, I'm going to cheat. One is that there's never a trial, there's never a hardship that goes to waste.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't. God uses those things in our lives. He uses it in the story of Daniel. The second thing that I would say is that Daniel teaches us how to survive in a world that isn't our friend.
Wow.
And that's what we're going to be talking about over the series is not just how to survive, but how to thrive in a world that is against us. And I'm going to give you just a little clue. Really, it starts with a foundation of faith that says God is in control. God's in control.
Thank you, pastors, for sharing your thoughts. I feel very challenged by all of this. We have lots to be thinking about, especially in terms of faith and trusting that behind all of this, it is God who is making these moves for our benefit and for our goal. And so we have to move forward in faith if we are going to learn to live our lives 10 times better.
So Psalm 23 talks about the darkest valleys or the valley of death, depending on what translation it is. And that's kind of where the valley I found myself in. I've been through a lot of different things, and at the time, I didn't really know Christ at all. And the way I handled those was not well. I just kind of fell apart. I got diagnosed with cervical cancer in January, and what we thought wasn't that bad on the PET scan actually ended up being a lot worse. And so it was really scary to kind of like be in that place where you're like, oh, like this could really kill me. That's terrifying. And so that's kind of where I was, and I had two choices. It was either like fall back into what I say like my old coping mechanisms were, or really just trust that God was in control and whatever was going to happen was going to happen, and either way it was going to be okay. I had a really odd peace in that time for my own like mortality, I guess. But as far as doubts, there was just some sort of peace that I found in just through praying about it, like it was really the only option. It was, this is a situation and I can't change it. And if I can't change it and I can't be in control of it like I like to be, then the only thing I can do is rely on God. I don't think many people look at a diagnosis like cancer and then be thankful to go through that, because it's a really scary and challenging experience. But I genuinely am thankful for being diagnosed with cancer, because without that, it's like it gave me confirmation that I really had grown in the Lord, and that my relationship with Him is stronger than it has ever been before. And there was nothing, like not even this horrible disease that kills people every day, was going to change that. I think it takes us all time to trust Him. We just have to consistently be in the Word and consistently pray that, He'll help us. We know the truth, like we know God will help us, and we spend a lot of time saying, yeah, I know God will help me, I know God will help me, but we don't spend nearly as much time asking Him to help us and to be active in the relationship with Him. And I think once I learned how to be active in the relationship with Him, that's where He finally brought peace. I don't think I would change anything that I've been through. I think God uses every single storm that we go through for a purpose, and I wouldn't want to change His purpose. It might, it might hurt me, and it might cause pain to my friends and my family and myself, but it's His purpose, and I'm not going to get in the way of that.
Ashley's story reminds us that there is purpose even in the dark times. God is still with us. We hope that this story and today's discussion will help prompt your group to talk through some important questions as we look at how Daniel was able to thrive even in a culture of injustice. There's never a hardship that goes to waste when we maintain our faith in God. You'll find a link to this week's discussion guide in the description below. As you go through these questions, we really hope that this spurs on some good conversation in your community groups. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.